The next speaker is going to tell us about some things that are very, very germane to our situation here. And that's about New Zealand. It's Jamie Walton. Jamie's been interested in monetary reform for a long time. And he has I detect a good sense of judgment in Jamie. And originally I thought, well, he'll go back and write the book on New Zealand monetary reform, maybe Australian monetary reform, and develop it in those areas. And that may be the way things go. Or he may do more work here. From what I know about New Zealand so far, New Zealand has some excellent case studies for us, outstanding, both positive and negative. And Jamie's going to tell us about both of them. So without anything further, please welcome Jamie Walton.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Well, I'm here presenting this talk this afternoon on behalf of Mr. Don Bethune, QSM, which stands for Queen's Service Medal. And Mr. Bethune is an inventor and a businessman and a researcher and an activist in politics in New Zealand. This talk is abstracted from a presentation by Don Bethune of the New Zealand Social Credit Institute based on his research paper summarising the results of two distinctly different economic experiences in New Zealand. I would also like to acknowledge the assistance of Ian Parker of the New Zealand Democratic Party for Social Credit and Mr. Bill Daly of the New Zealand Social Credit Association for providing supplementary information. First of all, allow me to briefly familiarise you with New Zealand. The two main islands, the North Island and the South Island, are situated in the South Pacific, about 1,200 miles southeast of continental Australia. The total land area is about the same as the state of Colorado. New Zealanders call themselves Kiwis, after our national bird. It's a bird that doesn't fly, but that's what we chose. And at this moment, there are about 5 million Kiwis in the world, about 4.2 million of whom live in New Zealand. New Zealand is a member of the United Nations and the Commonwealth of Nations, which is what used to be the British Empire, and New Zealand is a good friend of the USA. So humans have the ability, when motivated to use it, to learn from their own experience and to learn from the experience of others. This is why research and experiment are so important. By this method, fact can be kept apart from myth. This talk will focus on the experiences of two 15-year periods of history and will compare the outcomes of two different economic experiments. The first experience involves the partial application of a monetary reform program influenced by some of the economic ideas of social credit. This period started in the depth of depression in 1935 and resulted in the height of prosperity by 1950. The second experience involves the extreme application of a free market ideology influenced by many of the economic ideas of the Austrian school. This period started with the height of optimism in 1984 and resulted in the depth of despair by 1999. People who are still alive today have lived through both of these experiences, so we can learn from them, not from theory. In order to be able to understand the two experiences, reference to the context of history is required. From the very outset, New Zealand has not had a very happy experience with laissez-faire theories in practice. New Zealand was formally established in 1840 with the signing of a treaty between representatives of the British Crown and some representatives of the indigenous Maori peoples. Before the treaty was even signed, a private company founded in London and calling itself the New Zealand Company was already arranging the settlement of immigrants to the anticipated colony. Almost immediately, this company was conducting practices that were declared illegal. The most damaging being the selling of land titles to settlers for land that the company did not own or had not acquired lawfully. This caused many disputes and conflicts over land between some of the settlers and Maori peoples, which later escalated into a series of land wars. Some of the grievances from this period are still being resolved today through costly legal processes of claims and compensation. Just have a look at those while I'm talking, and just goes through in the timeline. New Zealand was 5 to 6 months sailing distance from Britain, so responses to requests were not received back until almost a year later. Remoteness meant officials in New Zealand had to decide their own courses of action, often guided by evidence, justice and expediency. Isolation meant settlers had to find homegrown solutions to their problems in true pioneer spirit, what came to be known as Kiwi ingenuity. Many of the settlers were reformers, and they were determined to establish a society free of the faults they saw in the one that they had left behind. New Zealand did not hold to any particular doctrine. It picked and put together the best ideas around at the time and decided how to put them to good use in common sense ways. The overriding ism was pragmatism. The rule of thumb for running things became doing whatever worked to suit the local situation and got the job done for the least cost and delay. Through trial and error, it was found that public bodies yielded the best results for the provision of infrastructure and services used by everyone. Because of the bad experience with land sales, most land was held in trust by government and was allotted to settlers under leasehold arrangements. This allowed many ex-soldiers to be assisted to settle on small farms. A significant portion of government revenues came from land rentals and land value-based taxation. So they were partially applying Georgist ideas at that time from the 1890s, from 1891 through to about 1912. So a significant portion of the revenue came from land tax, and the main other portion at the time came from customs duties on things crossing the border, coming in or going out, and also internal excise taxes to a certain extent. Before the start of World War I, New Zealand had become one of the most democratic and socially advanced countries in the world. You can see the things that have been achieved going down the timeline. New Zealand was regarded as a model of prosperity with a decent level of general well-being. But tough work conditions remained, and setbacks on the industrial front led to widespread dissatisfaction amongst the organised labour groupings, which united to turn the labour movement toward greater political action. A conservative political party, calling itself the Reform Party, was elected to power, promising the small leaseholding farmers they could be freeholders. And so there was a process delayed because of World War I, but then carried on after World War I of converting the leasehold land titles to freehold land titles. So that was basically the end of the partial Georgist experience there. The majority of small farmers were dairy farmers, and the majority of dairy factories were owned by cooperatives of local dairy farmers. By pooling their resources, they retained control of the process. After the horrors and losses of the Great War, most people wanted a better deal. A fair go, as we say in New Zealand. By then, some people in the labour movement and many small farmers had become aware of the money trick and started spreading the word. There were some prosperous years in the 1920s, and farmers were assisted through statutory marketing boards to expand exports. You can see there's wool, meat, dairy, and then later on fruit, and then later on kiwi fruit. Could you put the next slide on, please, Steve? The worldwide slump hit hard. Export prices collapsed. Farmers and businesses faced financial difficulties, unemployment soared, and discontent erupted into riots in the streets of the main cities. The government tried to provide relief with various work schemes, but they were restrained by the dictates of prevailing financial orthodoxy to balance their budget at all costs. And there were attempts for public works and all types of schemes that were started up, but that orthodoxy, that dictate, restrained a lot of things that could have been done then to relieve people. And there was, in following the advice of experts, that Sir Otto Niemeyer of the British Treasury Department, and before that of the Bank of England, he toured Australia and New Zealand, and he advised everybody that they had to tighten their belts and produce more, which is an impossible suggestion. And trying to do it just made things worse. You know, the retrenchment just became a downward vicious circle. So near starvation was rife in the cities, while farmers ploughed composted vegetables and fruit into the ground to try to force prices up over the freight of costs to market. Families often made meals out of food normally given to animals. And again, this is following the advice of the bankers and the financial experts. Families had to make handmade clothes out of whatever materials were available or salvageable, and bed linen was made from sacking cloth. And those years were known as the sugar bag years. The harsh conditions stimulated the common and overlapping interests of workers and family farmers to cooperate. And house meetings were organised, bringing both groups together to discuss policies and actions. Many workers and small farmers reckoned that they had been screwed for too long by the existing banking fraternity, and they were impressed by the common sense and basic honesty of the social credit proposals. The Social Credit Association was set up in New Zealand, and within 2 years they had about 140 branches. That's about 2 per constituency seat of the Parliament, and they had thousands and thousands of active members, and with their allies they drew huge meetings and rallies. And there was a tour by the founder, Major Douglas, and there was massive meetings in all the main centres in Australia and in Canada and in New Zealand at that time. And there was also evidence given to commissions of inquiry in all the countries, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. And so that activity had a big influence. There was a big influence of social credit money reform ideas within the Labour Party caucus. And monetary reforming faction in the Labour Party advocated social credit type policy proposals, and there were mass rallies. At that time, the main city, Auckland, had only a population of 300,000, but there was political rallies there that attracted over 100,000 people. And the main demand was to get rid of the money power. And that was politically popular then. You know, it was the most popular issue in the country at that time. So the government was elected partly on that platform. At that time in 1935, the population of New Zealand was a little over 1.5 million. The Reserve Bank had been set up in the previous government, in the last year of the previous government, on the advice of the Bank of England and Sir Otto Niemeyer, and of course they advised that it be set up as a private bank. But when the new government came in, one of the first things they did was to buy off the private shareholders and turn the Reserve Bank of New Zealand into a public state institution. And the Prime Minister, after the election victory at the big meeting, he said to the bankers that if you don't like this, you can go. You know, most of the banks were Australian or English banks. There was only one New Zealand bank in the whole country. But of course they didn't go because they ended up doing very well out of it when the economy recovered. So having the Reserve Bank of New Zealand nationalised enabled the government to use its credit creating capability to finance a raft of initiatives. By taking control of the people's credit and currency, low or no interest loans were possible for public purposes. So the key policies were buying out the Reserve Bank and using it to finance its programs and projects. There was an extensive program of building houses. Before they did this, they did a survey of the housing conditions in New Zealand to work out what the conditions were like and what the requirements were for improving them. And then they went ahead and did it. And so a Department of Housing Construction that was already existing was set up and run by the main advocate of the monetary reform faction and was administrated by a very capable administrator. And between them and using the assistance of the private sector, building contractors, and also architects, they built 2,500 houses each year. So that's what, five a day. And so in 4 years they built 10,000 houses for people to live in. And at the opening of the very first house, there was a ceremony and all of the cabinet ministers of the government carried in the furniture for the new tenants of the new house. You know, symbolising that they were rolling up their sleeves and doing something to help the New Zealand people. Later on, this administrator that was in charge of running the house building program was the chairman of a commission of inquiry in 1955 to 1956 on monetary, banking and credit systems. And in that, he said that the government can issue money at 0% interest or even not require the money to be returned. But the main recommendations of that inquiry were to curtail the schemes of using the people's credit and to deregulate the banking system. But during the time in the 1930s and 1940s, they used the facility of the Reserve Bank credit to build the houses. They used it to build dams and hydroelectric dams to provide more electricity. They used it to provide a guaranteed minimum price for dairy farmers on their butterfat, and that stabilised the situation for the whole farming sector. Now, all of these schemes that did make use of the Reserve Bank facility, they financed these at an actual net cost of about 1%, which was about the interest rate that they were charging. Now, I'll repeat that. This real wealth that was created, the net actual cost was just the cost of the interest drawn back out of the economy. That's what Don Bethune says anyway, and I wish he was here to be able to explain it in more detail, but you can ask me about it at the end of the talk. So what were the results of this? New Zealand recovered from the Depression within 2 years, well before the outbreak of World War II. In Australia, the media was looking at New Zealand and calling it a paradise by 1938. So that's quite a turnaround, just 2 years. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the proof was evident. people were eating well again. These schemes were carried on throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, the 1960s and the 1970s, and even into the 1980s, partially to a limited extent, and they were being curtailed incrementally. But the basic strategy at the time was, in the short term, stabilisation, leading on in the medium term to development. And in the 1950s and 1960s, New Zealand developed most of its hydroelectric power schemes and its large infrastructure, national infrastructure. And then in the long term, that would lead on to self-sufficiency. So by the 1970s and early 1980s, New Zealand was almost there and could have been there, but there are a few external things that happened which severely affected New Zealand, one of them being when the United Kingdom went into the EEC, which was the European Economic Community, and so they no longer guaranteed purchasing all of our farm products. And the other thing that happened was in 1973 and then again in 1979, there were oil shocks. And New Zealand had not been able to, at that time, develop its own oil fields to be self-sufficient. So, like most other countries, they're very dependent on oil imports and requiring foreign reserves for that and foreign exchange for that. So that had a big impact. But, you know, there's a lot of very good schemes that were initiated then. Universal national superannuation, which is a universal pension, everybody gets it. Of course, there was free healthcare, free education, all of that stuff that is in the American Monetary Act. Can you move to the next one, please? So, actually not yet. I'll put the other one back. So New Zealand was a model egalitarian society, and New Zealanders were proud of it. In New Zealand, the American dream wasn't a dream, it was a reality. But then it was undone. Now. What happened, I can only describe as a non-militaristic coup, a political coup. There was, in 1984, in the election campaign, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the way things were, and the government that was the opposition, which again was the Labour Party, the same party that had introduced all of those things you saw just before, they were talking vaguely about running the government along commercial lines and in a more business-like manner. And so there was a small group, really, of there's one finance minister, one associate finance minister, one big business lobby group front person, and 2 or 3 Treasury Department officials. And these people were all very heavily influenced at some stage in their lives by the Austrian school in Hayek and all of that. And so Friedrich Hayek, I think that's how you say his name, I'm not sure how, I've never heard it spoken in the last 3 months. And so basically their plan was to deregulate everything and to privatise any public assets or services that were saleable. And their tactic for doing this was to do it so quickly that people just had no time to react to it. And so new legislation kept churning out, you know, on a weekly basis, and people just were stunned. They didn't know what was happening to them. And it was mainly done in two-year bursts, in 1985 and 1986. And then again, that became so unpopular that Labour Party was voted out, and a National Party was voted in, who was the main opposition, and they were voted in saying that they promised to stop it and that they would return New Zealand to a decent society, but then when they came into power they did exactly the same thing and even more. So you'll see that social welfare payments were cut in 1990. number of unemployed was 100,000 in 1988. At one stage in New Zealand, the number of unemployed was 12. And the Prime Minister used to send each person a birthday card saying, hope you get a job soon. But then it went up to 100,000, and that hadn't been like that since 1933. And
Did you mean 12,000 or 12?
12.
12.
That's what I've been told. So, yeah. In 1991, the number of unemployed was more than doubled. It was well over 200,000. Then all of these other things, public health systems and the housing and education system. There didn't used to be any university fees. It used to be free to go to university if you qualified for it. And all of these government MPs, they all got their university, education for free. But then they denied it. I mean, when I left school, these fees started coming in, so I didn't go to university. And all my cousins, just a few years older than me, they had all of their university for free. And all of a sudden, it all changed. So, what had happened up until that time was that New Zealand had applied the first and third components of the American Monetary Act, more or less, and it worked. That's the important thing, it worked. The country had recovered from the worst depression ever within 2 years and had become a paradise by the relative standards of other countries. The problem was that they did not apply the second component of the American Monetary Act, which is to stop the private banking system from creating the bulk of the money supply. So that's a lesson there. Since the effective giving away of national financial independence and sovereignty after 1984, the social credit movement in New Zealand focused more on while continuing to try and educate people about monetary, financial and economic reform aspects of social credit, it also focused its attentions on the political reform aspects of social credit. The first step they saw in New Zealand's situation was to get better political representation, because the social credit movement set up a party that was getting 20% of the vote in lots of elections, and in lots of the parts of the country they were getting 1 vote in 3, but they only ever got 2 seats in Parliament out of 100. So that one of the things they wanted to do was to get better political representation. So they were effective in organising a movement to get proportional representation voting, and there was a referendum held and that passed later on, 1993. And one of the other things they've been pressing for, and which is getting closer, well, they pressed for also more citizens-initiated referenda, and they got that as well. But then there was a series of referenda, and the government decided, oh well, we don't have to implement this referendum, so they didn't. They ignored the requirement of the people on some issues. On some of them they went along with it, but on others they didn't. So now what is being pushed for is binding citizens-initiated referenda, running along the lines of the model system that is operating in Switzerland. So New Zealand has always been a reforming country and a reforming influence on the world, although you may not know it. Now the very word reform can no longer be used. The very word was stolen by the free market ideologues who sold their destructive deregulation and internationalisation agenda under the banner of reform. All of these deregulations and all of this things that exchanges would be floating, being done miraculously in space somewhere, that was all called economic reform. So now many New Zealanders would be opposed to anything that had the word reform in it, because they feel the country has been reformed to death. We will have to use another word apart from reform in New Zealand. One reason for the main difference between the two experiences I've talked to you about, between 1935 and 1950, and then between 1984 and 1999, In the first case, most of the political candidates actually listened to the people. They went to the dairy farmers and said, what do you need? We need to be able to sell our products at this price. The politicians and the other people asked them, what do you need to stop tipping the milk into the river? We need this amount of money to be able to carry on. So that's what happened when they were elected. When the majority of elected representatives, yes, they actually carried out the policies that most people wanted. In the second case, nobody knew what was coming. Most of the political candidates only pretended to listen to the people, but instead they were only really listening to perceived experts. And the majority of elected representatives carried out the policies of the experts against the will of the people. The first case was more democratic. The second case was undemocratic. So you have a sovereign democracy implementing two contrasting economic experience with no visible outside intervention, but with professional official statistics agency collecting data all the time. What a great opportunity for analysis by economic researchers and presenting it and publicising it to the people. But that hasn't really happened yet. And perhaps the reason is simple. The outcome of both experiments was completely opposite to what the experts listened to or employed by the news media had predicted. In the first case, in 1935, they said that the proposals were crazy and that the country would be bankrupt within 2 weeks. But within 2 years, they had gone from the depths of despair to the heights, or well on the way to recovery, and were being called a paradise compared to other countries at the time. But of course, it's unnewsworthy if the experts being interviewed are not, it's not happening on the ground. So now the main similarity between the two experiences is that, yes, in both cases, what actually happened was the exact opposite of what the experts who were predicting at the time say would happen. So despite being demonstrably false, like myths, like Dr. Goebel's lies, are commonly accepted through constant repetition. At the time in 1984 and all that time we were told there is no alternative. This is what we have to do. This is what everyone else is doing. This is what we have to do. So constant repetition by people who were perceived as being credible. When you really look at propaganda of economics, it's quite clear that it is usually directed at being anti-government. Sorry, I'm talking about the economics from 1984 onwards. It is usually directed at being anti-government, but much worse than that. It is almost always anti-human. It's anti-human. And here's the rub, folks. Unfortunately, the USA is not the only country in the world with a huge irony deficiency and chronic cultural amnesia. New Zealand, and probably every other country in the world, has been given a big dose of these awful diseases as well. The administrator who organised the state housing program using Reserve Bank credit, and who later chaired the Royal Commission of Inquiry, the same person who had that experience of all the great things that application of that had done for people, putting them into homes, happy homes, then the same person recommends to stop doing that and to deregulate the banks and to run everything on commercial rates of interest. The former finance minister who implemented all of these from 1984 onwards is on the record. He states, and he still states, even this year, he's on the public record that New Zealand had the highest standard of living in the world when he was at university studying economics for free in the mid-1950s. And he was the same person who in the mid-1980s was responsible for dismantling all of the apparatus that led to New Zealand having the highest standard of living in the world. It's amazing. That's the power of propaganda, I suppose. The current finance minister, who stated and still states on public record that the government can create money for public purposes, also says that New Zealand has to borrow money from overseas because the population here does not save enough. While this may endear him to the international banking fraternity, to anyone with even an elementary knowledge of banking mechanics, it is absolute rubbish. The current leader of the opposition, who may become Prime Minister after our general election on Saturday, the 8th of November, we have our elections on days that people can actually go out to vote in New Zealand. He lived in a state house when he was growing up as a little boy, and he went to university for free, did economics and finance and all that thing, and then when he graduated, soon after, he went to work for Merrill Lynch in London and took part in wild speculation games against the New Zealand dollar. And he has vowed to privatise all of the remaining public assets if he's elected, and he's vowed to borrow money from overseas so that people in New Zealand can have tax cuts.
Imagine that.
Well, it's amazing, but this is the truth. This is the power of propaganda. So what is the common strand that binds these highly intelligent and capable individuals to this nonsensical and self-contradictory thinking? To me, it appears to be an unfounded belief in false economics. In reality, what good is a system that ignores facts and does not do what people want it to do? When will economics get real? When will economics become human? When will an economist stand up and say the free market doesn't work, the free market is a myth based on lies? When will an economist stand up and say that the debt money system doesn't work, the debt money system is a myth based on lies? When that happens, there will be rejoicing around the world. But we cannot rely on economists doing anything like that. We the people have to do that. We have to build the pressure for that ourselves. And we do need the help of economists, and there are good economists around, and we have some in this audience today. And we do need their help. But we also have to build the pressure ourselves. So folks, you have to ask yourself a question. What am I going to do about it? Not me, but you. Don't underestimate what you can do about it. Don't underestimate what we can do about it. Thank you.